At 3:00 a.m. on December 11, 1978, one of the most important crime scenes in American history made no sound at all. No alarms, no gunshots, no panicked radio calls, just silence so complete that it would take years for anyone to understand what had really happened. Inside a cargo terminal operated by Lufthansa at JFK Airport, 6 men stepped out of a stolen van and walked calmly into a space designed to move millions of dollars without ever being noticed. Within minutes, security guards were controlled, employees were reduced to terrified compliance, and a vault door opened using a code that was never supposed to fail. What waited inside was not just money, it was temptation on an industrial scale. Wooden crates split open, spilling stacks of $100 bills bundled in $125,000 packs, far more than anyone had planned, for far more than anyone could safely disappear. In under 30 minutes, more than $5 million in cash, along with gold and diamonds, vanished into the night. By sunrise, the story dominated every major news outlet in the country. Law enforcement called it impossible. The public called it genius. But what almost no one understood was this: the robbery itself was the least dangerous part of what had just begun. Because in the world of organized crime, stealing money is easy. Living with it while everyone around you knows what you did is what gets people killed. This wasn't just the biggest cash heist America had ever seen. It was the moment greed, fear, and silence locked into a collision course that would destroy nearly everyone involved, leaving behind a perfect crime on paper and a trail of consequences no one could erase. What made the Lufthansa heist extraordinary was not the courage of the men who carried it out, but the architecture behind it. This was not a crime fueled by adrenaline. It was a system designed to eliminate chaos before it could appear. At the center of that system was Jimmy Burke, a man who understood that power in organized crime didn't come from how loudly you could threaten someone, but from how predictably you could control outcomes. Burke didn't see people as partners or enemies, he saw them as variables. Every employee inside the Lufthansa cargo terminal represented a potential failure point, and every failure point had to be neutralized without drawing attention. That meant no violence unless absolutely necessary, no improvisation, and no emotional attachment. The inside man wasn't a conspirator in Burke's mind. He was leveraged, someone whose debt and fear could be calibrated like a lock combination. The guards weren't obstacles. They were routines to be interrupted briefly and then forgotten. Even rival crime families were treated not as threats but as administrative problems to be solved with quiet payments and temporary agreements. The brilliance of the plan lay in its restraint. Burke planned for a robbery that would feel boring to watch because boredom is what security systems are built around. Nothing unusual, nothing memorable. For 30 minutes, everything moved exactly as expected, and that was the danger. Because the moment the vault opened and the scale of the money became clear, the plan crossed an invisible line. $5 million in 1978 wasn't just wealth, it was destabilizing force. It was enough to turn discipline into temptation and loyalty into calculation. Burke had designed a crime that could defeat alarms, cameras, and law enforcement protocols, but no plan can fully account for what happens inside people when the reward exceeds the original agreement. In that moment, the heist stopped being a technical operation and became a psychological experiment, one that would test who could live with silence, who could live with fear, and who would eventually crack under the weight of knowing they had touched something too large to ever safely let go. By the time federal investigators arrived at JFK, the crime scene was already working against them. There was no chaos to reconstruct, no obvious violence to trace, no mechanical failure to reverse engineer. The robbery had left behind something far more unsettling than destruction normalcy. To the FBI, that absence of disruption was its own kind of evidence, a signal that the system hadn't been breached by force but by familiarity. Every early theory pointed to an inside job, yet theory alone couldn't unlock warrants or force cooperation. Agents interviewed employees who remembered almost nothing clearly, not because they were lying, but because nothing had stood out as wrong in the moment. Security logs showed routines, not anomalies. Cameras captured movement, but nothing illegal. The airport had done exactly what it was designed to do, process money invisibly, and in doing so, it had erased the crime itself. This was the kind of case that made seasoned investigators uneasy, because it suggested a level of planning that mirrored institutional thinking. The robbers hadn't outsmarted individuals. They had outthought the system. Weeks passed. Surveillance teams were deployed, informants were quietly pressed, Whispers began to surface about familiar names and familiar bars, but whispers don't survive in court. To law enforcement, the most disturbing realization was not that a crime had occurred, but that no immediate pressure could be applied to stop what might follow. In organized crime, silence is rarely passive, it's enforced. The longer the investigation stalled, the more dangerous the vacuum became, because when the state cannot impose consequences, internal discipline takes over. Investigators understood this instinctively. They knew that somewhere decisions were being made, not in offices or courtrooms, but in private spaces where fear carried more weight than subpoenas. The case didn't feel cold. It felt suspended, as if it were being held in place by forces operating outside the reach of the law. And that suspension created a new kind of tension, one that had nothing to do with solving the robbery, and everything to do with what silence would cost the people who knew too much. The FBI could wait. The men behind the heist could not. The moment the true size of the take became clear, the Lufthansa heist crossed a line it could never step back from. What had begun as a controlled operation instantly transformed into a liability management crisis, and everyone involved could feel it, even if they didn't yet have the language to name it. $5 million in 1978 wasn't just unexpected profit. It was a destabilizing force large enough to pull gravity inward. Too many people knew. Too many people had touched it. Too many conversations had already happened that could never be taken back. And in that environment, money stopped being a reward and became a threat. At the center of this pressure stood Jimmy Burke, who understood something the others were slow to grasp. The robbery was already over, but the danger was only beginning. Law enforcement attention could be managed with patience and distance, but human behavior was unpredictable. Fear spreads faster than loyalty, and greed corrodes discipline quietly from the inside. Burke watched his crew celebrate talk too freely, spend too loudly, and he saw the future forming in real time. He knew that the biggest risk wasn't betrayal driven by malice, but panic driven by imagination. Men lying awake at night replaying the vault, counting money they hadn't yet received, wondering who else might talk first. In Burke's world, uncertainty was intolerable. Silence had to be absolute or it was useless. What followed wasn't announced or coordinated in the way people expect conspiracies to unfold. It was procedural, almost administrative. Problems were identified. Problems were removed. One disappearance was rationalized as coincidence. Two suggested bad luck. By the third, the message no longer needed explanation. The internal logic was brutal but consistent. Anyone who increased the risk profile of the operation became a liability, and liabilities could not be allowed to accumulate. This was the real escalation of the Lufthansa story, not violence for its own sake, but violence as policy. Each decision narrowed Burke's circle, concentrating control while amplifying paranoia. The irony was cruel. The more effectively he eliminated threats, the more isolated he became, and isolation bred its own form of instability. By trying to preserve silence through fear, Burke guaranteed that fear would eventually speak louder than loyalty ever could. The heist had succeeded perfectly on paper, but in practice it had created a system that could only sustain itself through constant erasure, consuming its own participants to maintain the illusion of control. What began as the smartest robbery in American history was quietly mutating into something far more dangerous, a closed loop where survival depended not on outsmarting the law, but on outlasting the people who stood beside you. By the time the consequences began to surface, the shape of the downfall was already set. Jimmy Burke had always believed that problems could be eliminated faster than they could accumulate, but time doesn't behave like a rival crew or a nervous accomplice. Time waits, watches, and erodes. The Lufthansa money didn't disappear quietly into the background of his operation. It distorted everything it touched. Spending habits changed. Attention sharpened. Law enforcement pressure, once distant, began to feel closer, not because the robbery had been solved, but because the environment around it was decaying. When drugs entered the picture, the balance finally tipped. Narcotics brought cash, but they also brought federal agencies that didn't negotiate, didn't bluff, and didn't look away. Burke ignored the old rules because he believed his system was stronger than tradition, but systems built on fear age badly. Associates grew reckless. Conversations became sloppier. And eventually someone was arrested with enough time in front of them to reconsider every oath they had ever taken. At that moment, loyalty stopped being a moral concept and became a survival calculation. The choice was no longer between silence and honor, but between cooperation and death. When one of Burke's closest allies began talking, the collapse accelerated, not because new facts were revealed about the heist, but because the violence surrounding it could no longer be contained. Burke was arrested not for Lufthansa, but for murder, the bodies that had piled up as he tried to protect a crime the law could never quite touch. There was a bitter symmetry to it. The robbery remained legally perfect, untouched by convictions or recovered money, while the aftermath left fingerprints everywhere. In court, prosecutors didn't need to explain how the vault was opened or how the cash vanished. They only needed to show what happened afterward, the pattern of fear, the missing men, the decisions that turned silence into a weapon. Burke was sentenced to prison where control meant nothing and patience meant everything. The robbery that made him legendary would never be proven against him, but it no longer mattered. His freedom had been traded away piece by piece in the attempt to preserve absolute secrecy. Time, the one variable he could never intimidate, had done what law enforcement alone could not. It didn't solve the crime. It outlasted the man who thought he could. The legacy of the Lufthansa heist is unsettling precisely because it refuses to resolve. No courtroom verdict ever closed it. No recovered cash ever offered proof that crime doesn't pay. Decades later, the case still exists as a paradox in American criminal history, a robbery that succeeded completely, yet destroyed nearly everyone who touched it. On paper, it remains unsolved. In reality, it reached its conclusion long ago, not through justice, but through exhaustion. The money vanished into private hands, offshore routes, and buried fear never resurfacing, never circulating cleanly enough to be traced. The public wanted a mastermind exposed, a final arrest that would restore balance, but what they received instead was something quieter and more disturbing. Jimmy Burke, the architect of the operation, never faced trial for the crime that made him infamous. He died in prison years later, punished not for the perfect robbery, but for the violence that followed it, a reminder that systems built on fear rarely collapse where you expect them to. The absence of accountability became the story itself. Law enforcement learned that technical perfection could defeat procedure, but only temporarily. Organized crime learned something more painful, that absolute control demands absolute isolation, and isolation corrodes judgment. Over time, the Lufthansa heist stopped being a tale about clever criminals and incompetent authorities and became a cautionary study in human limits. You can intimidate people into silence, but you cannot make silence stable. You can erase witnesses, but you cannot erase memory. Every act meant to secure the crime pushed its participants further into a corner where survival required constant vigilance, constant violence, constant denial. For the public, the heist entered mythology, retold as a symbol of audacity and intelligence. For those who lived inside it, it became a closed loop with no exit. The most enduring impact of the Lufthansa robbery isn't the money or the mystery, but the lesson it leaves behind for anyone tempted by shortcuts to power systems that reject accountability, don't escape consequences. They internalize them. Pressure doesn't disappear when it's hidden. It compounds. Fear doesn't fade when it's enforced. It multiplies. The robbery proved that law enforcement can be outmaneuvered, but it also proved something far more enduring, that no human network can survive sustained paranoia without turning inward. In the end, the crime didn't fail because someone talked. It failed because it demanded too much silence from too many people for too long. The money was never found. The case was never solved. But the cost was paid in full, not by the system that was fooled, but by the men who believed that removing every loose end would somehow leave them free. The Lufthansa heist endures not because it was clever, but because it exposes a hard truth Americans understand instinctively. Systems built on fear and shortcuts always collect their debt later. You can outsmart procedures, manipulate people, and even evade justice for a time, but you cannot outrun human nature. Silence decays. Greed escalates. Time closes in. This story isn't just about crime. It's a warning about any pursuit of power without accountability. If this investigation made you think, question, or see familiar patterns in a new way, support deep, long-form storytelling like this. Like the video, share it with someone who values truth over spectacle, and subscribe for more cinematic investigations that go beyond the headlines.